The English Bible is the Bible of the common English person, a Bible for those who speak or write in the English dialogue instead of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. However, there is a problem arising as to what English translation to use. Some people believe we can rely on getting the same message and the same gospel from modern translations such as ESV, NASB, HCSB, NIV, New King James Version, New Living Translation, New English Translation, and so on and so on. But there is a movement out there that thinks only one English translation, known as the King James Version, is the correct text. This movement is about as old as the 1930s itself. In 1930, a staunch Seventh-day Adventist missionary by the name of Benjamin G. Wilkinson was known for his book entitled Our Authorized Bible Vindicated. Though the movement did sort of existed before the book was released, his book popularized the movement as well as the arguments that would later come in today's society. Arguments such as the Westcott and Hort text weren't correct, claims that there was corruptions introduced in the Old Testament Greek Septuagint by early church father Origen, and not to mention the view that the Masoretic text and the Textus Receptus are the only superior of the manuscripts we have today. Also, we shouldn't forget this book also uses the common demonizing of the Alexandrian text, stating that just because it was from Alexandria, it had to have had pagan or Wiccan influences. Not to mention, this book even went so as far to claim that the Westcott and Hort texts were the two false witnesses that were mentioned in Matthew 26, verse 60. The follow-up would be a result of other books contributing to the movement as well as its followers. It didn't start until Gail Riplinger appeared with her 1993 book, New Age Bible Versions, that the movement sort of began to popularize even more for modern America. This book claimed that modern translations not only changed the words and doctrines, but that it taught pagan and satanic ideas. Today, we still have well-known advocates of the movement such as Kent Hovind, Stephen L. Anderson, Sam Gibb, and among others who preach that an Old English 1611 Bible is the only inspired Word of God that is holy, and that the people that wrote it were moved and inspired by God Himself. But while I think all English translations are not perfect, does their claims hold any validity to the original Greek and Hebrew? Does the Hebrew or the Greek even matter anymore? Do we have the originals? Let us take a look into the history of the Bible's language and its manuscripts. The reason that the biblical Hebrew and Greek is important is because it was the original spoken and written language of the Bible. The Greek is not spoken, however, we need to keep that in mind, but it is a written language. The Old Testament was written in the BC era and were originally written on leather scrolls. These scrolls were preserved for the purpose of reading at festivals and other occasions. The earliest that we have of a leather scroll is, in the same sense of its material and writing, is in 586 BC. Soon later, in 168 BC, a Jewish uprising against the Syrian ruling caused most of the manuscripts to be destroyed during this time period. But hope still burned bright in everybody as a group of Jewish scholars known as Masoretes did their very best in keeping the text alive in its original language. While we have many good manuscripts, we found one good set of manuscripts that would be considered one of the greatest discoveries in the 20th century.
There is a story, you can see the people behind them. You can see this man running for 3 kilometers from Qumran with a scroll that described his dream, his temple. The Romans were coming. But he wanted future generation to read it. I don't know his name, but he managed to pass it on 2,000 years ago.
The Dead Sea Scrolls date back from the 1st century BC all the way to the 1st century AD, and is considered a very important discovery in archaeology. However, when we compare the old Isaiah scroll found in this to the Isaiah in the Masoretic text, we will find that these two are an exact replica. The reason for this is because the Jewish scribes and authors would be careful in getting an exact copy finished. If they made a mistake, they would get rid of the entire copy and start all over again. Or so we have been told.
The biggest myth about scribing that I've encountered is the myth that scribes can't make any errors, or else they have to start over from the very beginning of the Torah. If and when I make a mistake, if I catch it right then and there, I try to remove as much ink as I can because it will be easier to scrape off.
But that's enough about the Old Testament. Let us get to the New Testament and learn about the Greek manuscripts that we have found. Greek was a language that wasn't really spoken, but it was more of a written language, and with the Greco-Roman influence in biblical times and areas, the language is sure to thrive there during that time and period. How many manuscripts of the Bible do we have in Greek? Well, what we do know is that we have 10,000 and more in Latin. We have 5,000 to 10,000 manuscripts in other languages, but so far we have about 5,800 or more manuscripts in the original Greek. Not to mention that we have at least 1 million quotes or more by early church fathers. We need more manuscripts, though, so that whenever we apply the science of textual criticism, we are able to cross-reference and check for the accuracy of the text. So far, there is only 40 lines of the New Testament that have been unresolved by textual criticism, leaving the modern accuracy of the New Testament to be by an estimate of 99.5% correct to this day. So what about the church fathers? What did they have to say on the issue, since they probably didn't have the originals and instead had copies?
There is no reason to assume the originals were just copied once and forgotten, or that scribes only had one copy to pull from. In fact, early church father Tertullian even seems to suggest the originals were still around when he was writing at the end of the 2nd century. Come now, you who would indulge a better curiosity, if you would apply it to the business of your salvation, run over to the apostolic churches, in which the very thrones of the apostles are still preeminent in their places, in which their own authentic writings are read. The Latin word for authentic normally refers to original documents, so it appears Tertullian is saying the originals were still in the churches to that day. He specifically refers to the letters of Corinthians, Philippians, Thessalonians, Ephesians, and Romans, and urges readers to visit these places to see the authentic writings for themselves. Even if Tertullian didn't mean the original scrolls the apostles wrote on, his testimony still tells us the Christians in his days were concerned with having accurate writings, and they were not discarding their copies as valueless, as skeptics suggest. And it's reasonable to suggest that if the manuscripts were read often, they were also copied often. And in fact, the amount of manuscripts we have today obviously suggests that. Ehrman's reasoning seems to imply New Testament copying was like a game of telephone, where a 4th century copy is a copy from one from a 3rd century, which in turn is a copy of one from the 2nd century, which is a copy of one from the 1st century, which was a copy of the original. But there is no reason to suggest the originals or the first copies were simply lost after they were copied once. Scribes could always go back to the earliest copies of their day that had survived and simply copy that. St. Irenaeus even testifies he had access to some of the earliest copies of the Book of Revelations, suggesting early copies were being preserved for accuracy and transmission. And the testimony of early church fathers indicates how sacred they consider these documents, so they were not carelessly being copied, but being held in high regard to preserve the faith passed down from the apostles.
Another thing to keep in mind, that also like the Jewish scribes, Christians didn't burn or get rid of their copies. They didn't have the authority to be like scribes with their writings. This doesn't eliminate the fact that we have a ton of manuscripts for the New Testament, though.
There was never a time when any one man or group of men had control over the text of the New Testament. There was never a Christian Uthman. All assertions regarding adding doctrines, changing theology, removing teachings, etc. are without merit. The Christian church was a persecuted minority without power to enforce a uniform textual transmission, as in Islam.
But not only do we have a large amount of manuscripts, but we have very early complete manuscripts and even earlier fragments. The oldest complete New Testament is within 300 years of the original, the closest of any ancient document. But we have even earlier witnesses and fragments, like this one, P52, from between 90 AD to 125 AD, and others like these, from approximately 170 AD to 220 AD. We also have a larger fragment from around this time in P75, which has 102 survived pages from Luke and John. Comparing this to other ancient documents, the earliest copy of the Iliad is far off with 500 years from its original, and Suetonius is 800 years from its original. As you can see, the New Testament is by far the closest to its original than any other ancient document. So if we are to be skeptical of the New Testament, then we should be even more skeptical of other ancient literature. In fact, we have about a dozen fragmented manuscripts dating to around the 2nd century, which represent about 40% of the entire New Testament, and we have 120 manuscripts around 300 years from the original, which is incredible compared to other ancient documents. But despite this, some scholars still argue the New Testament copies are too late and full of errors.
Well, how does this compare to other ancient literature? The average classical Greek writer has less than 20 copies of his works still in existence. Less than 20 copies. In fact, that's a very, very high estimate. Most of them have 1 or 2 copies. But if you stacked up these 20 copies, they'd be about 4 feet high, right about here. How high would the stack of New Testament manuscripts be? Well, let's do a comparison. You know, I've got to kind of make it a triple stack. Maybe it's that much. Okay, yeah, a little bit more. No, I think it's more than that. We should keep going. It's getting better. And that is as much as I could do in PowerPoint. Multiply that New Testament stack by 8. And it's more than 1 mile high. More than a mile high of manuscripts for the New Testament compared to the average classical author, about 4 feet high. We have so many more manuscripts for the New Testament than anything else in the ancient world. It's absolutely an embarrassment of riches.
We also should keep in mind skeptics and atheists will say that there are about 400,000 textual variants like spelling errors and rewordings in these manuscripts. Why do we have these? Do these affect doctrine? Well, let's take a look at why and see if it does.
Ehrman and other skeptics will usually throw out the fact that there are 400,000 variants across New Testament manuscripts, which is in fact true. However, when you look at the details, this isn't a big deal. For example, the reason we have so many variants is because we have so many manuscripts. That would be expected with such a high number of manuscripts. But even with that, remember we have close to 6,000 New Testament Greek manuscripts, which comes to about 2.6 million pages of New Testament. If you do the math, that is 1 variant per 6.5 pages. Not really that much. Second, what kinds of variants are there? Well, 75% of them are simply spelling errors, which do not affect the meaning of the text. 15% are variation in Greek synonyms and transpositions, which cannot even be translated. About 9% do affect the meaning of the text, but they are from very late documents, and obviously resolved by looking at earlier manuscripts. Then, less than 1% do actually affect the meaning of the text and are from early manuscripts. But none of these variants actually challenge or affect essential Christian doctrines, as Bart Ehrman even admits. The position I argue for in misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament.
This is the guy on whose works Muslims and atheists are basing their wild claims that the Orthodox have so corrupted the text that it must not have been Orthodox at all originally. They don't know what they're talking about, but they're basing it on Dr. Ehrman's work. He does know what he's talking about. I happen to disagree with him about a number of things, but I don't disagree with him over this. In fact, in our 3 debates, at the end of each debate, I say, by the way, I think you agree with me, Bart, that essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants. And I put this screen up. He's never disputed it. He said it. It's in print. He can't deny himself.
there is absolutely no evidence to suggest Christian doctrines are affected by variants in the manuscripts, and there is next to zero evidence to suggest we cannot get back to the originals.
So even if some of these so-called corrupt manuscripts have a different form of textual variants being used, it doesn't change or affect essential Christian doctrines. Intellectual theist and agnostic scholars both agree on this when looking at the history. So we can trust the manuscripts we have of the Old Testament because they have been preserved by Jewish scribes over the centuries of authorship. And we can certainly trust the manuscripts of the New Testament due to textual criticism and the history. Matter of fact, if you want to check out these manuscripts for yourselves, websites today exist so that you yourselves can see them for yourselves, if you know or understand the Greek, that is. It is an honor and a rare privilege to even have these manuscripts to begin with, especially since the papyri, material that is used for what the Greek was written on, is such a sensitive material that only lasts about 1,000 years at its maximum. However, this is only one step of our journey into learning about and trusting and looking on the other translations of the Bible in the modern era of English America. In the next episode, we will examine St. Jerome and his Latin Vulgate, which would not only be used as the official Latin version for the Roman Catholic Church, but also as something to examine in the English Bibles to come.